I grew up in a middle-class family in the suburbs of Chicago, and my life was as mundane as many of my peers. My parents were ordinary people, just like thousands of others, neither rich nor poor, but just hardworking, simple people who earned their bread honestly. My father, Tom, worked for the police for 30 years. How many lives he managed to see, how many destinies he managed to rewrite over all these years, I never knew until the end. He was not a hero in the sense that it is portrayed in films, but rather a strong, calm man with clear eyes and a firm voice who always knew what to do. But his job was not just a daily job, but something deeper and more personal. He was protecting his city, his family, and, of course, me. My mom, Sarah, still works as a secretary at Lincoln Elementary School. This is her calling, her world. Despite her routine work, Mom never complained. She always said that the main thing was to do her job well. She was able to find joy even in the most mundane things, whether it was a cup of tea in the shade of trees or evening walks in the park with us when I was still a little girl. They both did everything so that I didn't need anything. But no matter how hard they tried, I always knew that money is not something that can be considered unlimited. We lived modestly, but with respect for work and values that provide a solid foundation for life. My life was simple. I graduated from college with a degree in accounting and immediately got a job at Anderson & Partners, a medium-sized accounting firm. Stability has always been important to me. The salary was decent, quite sufficient to cover all needs, and the job promised to be not only stable, but also quite calm. I thought this would be my life, waking up in the morning, going to work, coming home, repeating day after day. There was nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, this lifestyle suited me perfectly. I was able to be content with what I had, and I wasn't looking for more. But everything changed one rainy October day when I literally ran into him. With Marcus. It was early morning. I was rushing to Starbucks to drink my usual coffee before work. I could have done it faster if it weren't for this stupid habit of taking a long time to choose which kind of coffee I want that day. There are too many options. In particular, I used to always take the same one, a latte with almond syrup. It was something familiar, soothing, like a mantra that I followed every day. I picked up a cup of coffee and almost bumped into a man who, by all accounts, was the worst choice for a collision. It was Marcus. He didn't look surprised. His face was focused, ready for anything. But, of course, I was in a panic. My coffee, as soon as I picked it up, spilled right on his expensive suit. I felt like the whole world was frozen. It took a second, but it felt like it took forever. The coffee spread over the fabric of his jacket, and I stood there, dumbfounded, with a blank stare, not knowing what to do. "Oh, my God. Sorry," I exclaimed, instinctively starting to wipe his jacket with napkins. These pathetic attempts were completely useless. I could only repeat in my mind how ashamed I was. At such moments, you realize how clumsy and helpless you look. I tried to justify myself, but words couldn't find a way out, and the only thing I could do was offer to pay for the dry cleaning, and immediately it was clear that this would not help. He stood in front of me, not losing his composure, although he looked slightly annoyed. His eyes, gray and penetrating, looked at me without much emotion. I caught a glimpse of an expensive watch glinting on his right wrist, and his fingers curling around the handle of the suitcase next to him. He was certainly one of those people who were used to attention, to luxury, and to the fact that everything in their lives happens on schedule. Such a person is definitely not used to his morning starting with spilled coffee on a suit. "It's all right," he said, lifting the corner of his lips slightly. But his words sounded like a noble but not entirely sincere form of politeness. He wasn't angry or impatient, but there was still a note of distant respect in his manner. I, in turn, continued to apologize, not even trying to hide my awkwardness. When everything calmed down and I realized that there was no way to fix the coffee, Marcus suggested that I could help him find the nearest dry cleaner where I could clean the suit. We both just stood there silently, looking at each other like two people meeting for the first time in a world of random collisions. The inconvenience did not disappear, but his presence somehow became less heavy. I still couldn't believe that everything would start at this point. Marcus was delighted when I brought home the news that I had been hiding from everyone for a long time, that we were expecting a baby. He circled me around our huge living room. His laughter was full of lightness and joy. I will never forget how he looked at that moment. His face is lit up with happiness. His eyes are shining like a boy who has just been given the most long-awaited toy. I told him that even Victoria and James seemed to have softened a little at the news, although their reaction was somewhat cold. Victoria, as always, could not resist her remarks. "At least the child will have a good upbringing," she said with an expression on her face that made me uneasy. She always tried to seem strong and confident, but sometimes her words sounded like she just wanted to emphasize that she was not completely comfortable with what was happening. However, despite her comments, everything else became unimportant at that moment. All these discontents, crooked looks and puzzled conversations, they lost all meaning when I held him in my arms. James Jr., so we named him, as Marcus insisted, in honor of his father, was born on a snowy December morning. Marcus and I were sitting in the delivery room at the time, and I remember how warm it was in that small room, how the silence that came when he was first placed on my chest rang softly in the air. This moment was so bright that I couldn't think of anything else. All the worries and insecurities about the future, all the difficulties with family and work just disappeared, and I realized that at this moment I have everything I need. Back then, in the first hours of JJ's life, everything seemed so clear to me. Marcus, with his deep attachment to family and responsibility, took on the role of not only a caring husband, but also a real father. He perceived fatherhood as something completely natural, as a kind of pattern, as if he had been preparing all his life to be like this, caring, present, always there. He came home early to play with his son, read him bedtime stories, and took us to the park on weekends. His soul opened up to this new role, and his love for us, me and JJ, was unconditional. It was a tenderness that Marcus had never shown anyone before, and I was happy to be the one who saw that side of him. The work at Reynolds Industries was going well, and Marcus began to succeed as CFO. He was promoted to new positions, he held senior positions, and became more and more successful. He was the person who was always listened to. His words were golden to everyone in the office. But with all this busy work, Marcus always found time for us, for the family. He was the very pillar of stability and love that gave me and our son a sense of security and peace. Meanwhile, I was working as an accountant at home. My job didn't require constant meetings or difficult decisions. All I had to do was keep books and keep track of the numbers, helping with the company's reporting. Everything was clear and understandable. I loved my job, its stability, its predictability, but still I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something important was out of my control. Being the wife of Marcus Reynolds was not just a role in the family, it was almost a public life. We have become a part of this world where every move is discussed, where every word has meaning. I was an accountant in my family, but I felt like my life gradually became part of a huge Reynolds Industries machine. JJ grew up, his first steps, his laughter, his questions about the world, all this became part of our daily routine. His small hands grabbed our fingers, his eyes sparkled with curiosity, and I couldn't imagine my life without this little creature. Marcus was my partner in this. He was so involved in the parenting process that sometimes it seemed to me that he knew everything better than me. It was not a manifestation of arrogance or a desire to control, no, it was just a sincere desire to be a better father, a better husband. We spent our evenings with our family, pretending not to pay attention to the whispers behind our backs. Whispers at Reynolds Industries parties about the accountant who married the boss's son gradually became a part of our lives. All these conversations, glances and rumors, they still remained within this brilliant and successful, but such a cold corporate structure, and I had already stopped responding to them. All that mattered to me was Marcus, JJ, and my house. Everything else has become less important. Those first 2 years were really good. Marcus took on the role of a father with such pleasure, and every day I felt more and more how this new stage in our lives filled me with joy. With him, I felt stronger than ever, as if everything in life, every decision, every step, was part of a single harmony. We were happy, although we understood that there was a lot of excess in our world, a lot of things that were trying to divide us. But as long as we had what was most important, the rest didn't matter. That night I went to bed crying, immersed in the darkness of my own doubts and bitterness. I tried to convince myself that Marcus was just under pressure from work, that everything would get better, that it was just temporary fatigue, and I had to be patient. But deep down, I knew that something had broken between us. There were no words or gestures that could fix it. It wasn't just a disagreement. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was something more, something that I couldn't understand, but at the same time I felt every day. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was losing him, that our world was falling apart, but I kept hoping that everything would sort itself out somehow. It was Tuesday when my world seemed to finally collapse. Marcus, as always, wrote that he would be late at work. These messages became more frequent and intense. He became more and more absorbed in his work, and more often I was left alone in our house, surrounded by silence, which became more and more intrusive every day. I was doing my daily chores, doing the usual cleaning in the apartment, looking around the rooms, which, as it seemed to me, had lost their comfort and spiritual atmosphere. When I got to his home office, something inside me stirred. I was curious what he was doing there so late, and, most likely, out of habit, I did not knock on the door, but quietly entered. His laptop was open on the table, the screen still bright, as it usually is when someone has recently used it. I was never suspicious. I trusted Marcus, despite everything, despite his late hours, despite his sullen silence that increasingly accompanied our dinners. I was not the kind of person who would go in search of hidden secrets. But at that moment, something in the air changed. Some elusive gust of anxiety gripped me. Maybe it was the way he left his email open, or maybe I was just tired of all the lies I was building up in my head. I couldn't just dismiss what I was feeling. I sat down at his desk, not quite sure what I was going to do. My heart was beating in my chest, as if it had a premonition of something terrible. I glanced at the screen, and my eyes instantly caught on one of the messages in his mail. Sophia Loran is a name I haven't heard before. My hand was shaking when I started reading. With each new letter, I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet, as if something from my world was beginning to disappear, as if I had entered a forbidden zone, violating an invisible boundary that had previously allowed me to feel safe. There were hundreds of messages between them, starting a few months ago. Sophia, as I understood from the correspondence, was a new director in one of his divisions at Reynolds Industries. At first, their communication was purely working, but then, gradually, they became more open. I couldn't help but notice how her letters were getting more personal. She wrote about how difficult it is to combine work and personal life, how she lacks rest, and how hard it is to be a woman in a leadership position. He answered, supported her, comforted her, and sometimes there was a warmth in his answers that was alien to me in recent months. I continued to read, unable to tear myself away. Marcus wrote to her how hard it was for him because of work, how sometimes he felt that he was losing touch with what was important. He complained of fatigue and that his relationships with colleagues had become more strained. He told her how much he appreciated her professionalism and, apparently, her listening skills. And then I found myself mentally comparing these letters with our conversations, with how rarely he shared his experiences with me. All I saw was his silence, his detachment, his refusal to talk about us and our relationship. But in these letters, I read about a man who was not ready to open up to me, but was ready to open up to Sophia. It was excruciating, and at some point I realized that I didn't want to read any more, that I couldn't stand it. I quickly closed the laptop, stood for several minutes, not knowing what to do with this information. Every word, every sentence felt like a knife in my heart. I never thought Marcus would be capable of such a thing. Or maybe I just never looked in the direction where this empty corner was hiding, behind which he hid his true feelings. Victoria Reynolds personally delivered them to my parents' front door, her lips curling into a satisfied grin as she handed me an envelope. This moment seemed to freeze in the air, and for a moment I couldn't believe my eyes. She stood in front of me, full of self-satisfaction and contempt, as if that was exactly how it was supposed to be. She always said that I wasn't good enough for her son, but now she was looking at me with a victorious expression on her face, as if she had won a war that never really happened. "I always knew you weren't good enough for my son," she said, her voice as cold as ice, and her every sentence was like a hammer breaking the last pieces of my doubts. I tried to answer something, but she had already turned around and left, leaving me in a void in which there was neither comfort nor protection. And that was the worst part. Marcus didn't just file for divorce. He sued for full custody of JJ. His lawyer filed documents claiming that I was an unsuitable mother. In these papers, they painted me as a woman unable to provide normal conditions for the upbringing of her son. And although every word, every line was false, it was difficult for me to dismiss these accusations. It all sounded like I had lost not only my husband, but also myself in the eyes of others. Everything that I had been building for so long collapsed with such a crash that I could barely perceive reality. During the first hearing, my lawyer tried to fight the false accusations made by Marcus' lawyer. "Mrs. Reynolds has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior over the past year," his lawyer said with defiant calm, and I felt a cold wave shackle me. "She drinks a lot, creates scenes of jealousy for no reason and has become unstable," he continued, his every word like a knife in my heart, and I could barely hold back tears. I was not ready for this, not ready for my world to be destroyed by lies, and even under such a mask of caring for a child. Thank God I kept all the evidence. When my lawyer presented the email correspondence between Marcus and Sophia, it became the turning point that turned the course of the case. These letters, full of their restrained and at the same time frank words, their meetings, their plans, it all became obvious to the judge. Part of me wanted to scream, but I just sat there, clutching the arms of the chair, trying to hold back my emotions. When the lawyer presented their correspondence, the judge looked different. He was not the same as before, he became more focused, and his expression changed. There was no simple indifference in his gaze. He began to understand what really happened. I was discouraged, but at the same time I felt strangely relieved. This evidence, this exposure of their relationship, their lies, all this revealed not only their infidelity, but also the whole background of what I did not notice until it was too late. The judge probably could not remain indifferent, as is often the case in such cases, and his questions became more acute. I remember how he looked up and, without hiding his surprise, asked, "Mr. Reynolds, can you explain how this relates to your desire for full custody of the child?" I saw him touch on the very moment that I had been hiding, the moment of betrayal, the moment that was beyond his and Marcus's cold and ruthless game. At that moment, I realized that I was facing more than just disagreements between husband and wife. It was much more than that. It was a clash of two worlds, two truths, two destinies. I sat there, feeling my hands tremble slightly, and watched the adults play their game, how they manipulate this world as if it were just another contract. But JJ was not part of that contract. He was real, he was my son, and despite everything that was happening, I was ready to fight for him. For us. I pushed them both towards the door, forcing Marcus and Sophia to leave my house. My hands were shaking, but I held back, despite all the storm of emotions that was raging inside. "Come out, baby," Sophia purred, her voice sounding like sweet poison laced with self-satisfaction. She clearly had no qualms about playing her games, as if the whole situation was just an exciting distraction for her. "There are probably fleas in this place anyway," she added with a malicious grin, and I couldn't help but notice how Marcus, without even glancing in my direction, was quietly walking behind her, as if their connection had become something more important than everything we once built. When they finally left, I hugged my parents tightly. My mother was crying, her tears were warm and sincere, but they could not overshadow the emptiness in my heart. Dad was standing next to me, and his face was stony. He looked like he wanted to hit something, break it, but he held back. It was hard for me to look at his expression. He has always been my mainstay, his calmness was what gave me strength. But now, looking at his gloomy face, I realized that I could no longer be the one who was waiting for salvation. I had to find my way. As soon as the Range Rover disappeared at our end of the street, there was a sharp, almost palpable smell of disappointment and pain in the air. But at that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. Not at myself, not at my life, but at everything they tried to impose on me. At Sophia, at Marcus, at their hypocrisy and arrogance. This whole situation was the last blow for me, which shattered the remaining illusions. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of iced coffee, trying to figure out what to do now. My thoughts were hazy, unsettled. I couldn't immediately accept the fact that it was over, but at the same time I felt liberated. I can't say that I was ready for new changes, but I could no longer continue to live in this distorted world. The silence was broken by my father's step. He came up to me and, without saying a word, sat down opposite me. There was no ordinary calmness in his eyes that I was used to seeing. They were filled with something more: determination, perhaps concern, or even annoyance. He was silent for a long time, but then he finally said, quietly, almost thoughtfully, "You know, honey, sometimes the best defense is a good offense." I looked up and met his gaze. It wasn't a warning, it was more of a tip. Dad always knew when to act, when to stop and wait, and when to take matters into his own hands. He continued, "Remember Mike Sullivan? He worked with me in the police, now he's a private detective. A very thorough guy, knows how to dig deep without leaving a trace." I froze, trying to make sense of his words. Mike Sullivan. Dad had mentioned him before when he talked about old cases he was involved in. He was a man who never left unresolved questions, and when others considered the case closed, he continued to look for answers. I thought about how easily they tried to ruin my life, how without any shame or remorse. About Sophia's smug face, her contemptuous tone, her cruel words about my parents. It was all part of one big plan in which I seemed to have lost my place. I remembered every one of her disgusting emails that she kept sending me, as if they were her way of staying close, of continuing this painful control. And it was only in the morning that I noticed one new thing: her comment on my LinkedIn photo. It was as exquisite a blow as anything else she did. A comment filled with mockery, expectant threat. And I realized that I no longer want to be a passive observer in this game. My heart was beating faster, and I felt something inside me start to change direction. I could no longer let them control my life, be a part of their cruel manipulation. I was no longer the Tasha who was afraid, who was trying to please everyone around me. In that moment, at that kitchen table, I felt that I could be strong, that I could be myself, despite everything that had happened. After all, I wasn't ready to be a victim anymore. I carefully collected all the evidence, making several copies, but I hadn't taken a step yet, because now I knew something important. Sophia did not calculate the time. It was obvious. She did not expect that I would be ready to fight, that I would not sit in a corner, cry, and put up with her cruel manipulations. I was no longer the kind of woman who relied on others, who expected someone to save her. I was gathering evidence to defend myself and my son. But I haven't taken the first step yet. I was waiting for the right moment to strike. And this moment has come. The call from Victoria arrived on Wednesday morning. Her voice was as cold as ever. I could even imagine her standing there, on the other end of the line, with her chin up and her tone arrogant. "James Reynolds' 60th birthday party is this Saturday," she said, as if she wasn't planning a celebration, but a root canal. I couldn't help but notice how she was focusing on the word must. There was not the slightest hint of politeness or a desire to be kind in her words. She continued, "We prefer it to be just a family matter. JJ should be there for his grandfather's birthday party. And since he's too young to come alone." Her voice became even more forced as she continued, "I left the offer hanging. Just remember that you were invited only as JJ's escort. Try to stay in the shadows and not embarrass anyone. The party starts at 7. I hung up the phone, and for a while I didn't want to think about anything. This fake benevolence, this hidden threat, all reminded me how subtly people are manipulated, playing on their weaknesses and desires. I knew that Victoria considered me too small a figure to have any right to attention, that for her I was just an extra element in this carefully constructed performance. But no matter what she thought, I couldn't let her step over me. James Reynolds' 60th birthday party was just as ostentatious as you'd expect. Expectations were not deceived. A luxurious mansion decorated in gold and crystals, waiters who discreetly and gracefully carried champagne on silver trays, and around there was radiance and brilliance, which seemed to be more important than anything, even than the people themselves. It was all like that, a stranger, so far from me and my ideas about the holiday. I felt every judgmental look, every subtle movement around me, as if the whole world was against me. Marcus, sitting with Sophia in the center of this splendor, was talking about something with an important expression on his face. There was that same aloof expression in his eyes that I once saw in his gaze, but always tried not to notice. All this luxury, this noise and fuss, all this was just a shell that hid the most obscure aspects of their lives. And I had no place here, among all these bright lights and arrogant smiles. I felt like an outsider, like a character who shouldn't have been at this party. I was invited only to be present as a shadow, as a mute observer of everything they created, but did not participate. However, I wasn't ready to become a shadow. I couldn't afford to be just JJ's escort, a person who would hide behind his shoulder without attracting attention. This was my battle, and I wasn't going to lose myself in order to please these people. Despite their looks, despite their attitude, I was here because it was important to me. My son, JJ, was my everything. I looked at his bright eyes, full of selfless love and trust, and it reminded me why I kept fighting. My life was no longer someone's shadow. I was a mother. And that meant the most. When the evening dragged into the silence of the night, I found a few minutes for myself. While JJ was having fun with the other kids in the next room, I quietly went to the window and looked out at the street. The street was lit up with lights, houses surrounded this mansion from different sides, and I suddenly felt the whole weight of what was happening becoming unbearable. But this pain was not new to me. It was just another step along the way. And I knew that if I passed it, I would become stronger. Over the course of several months, I carefully built my plan, collecting every piece of evidence, every clue. I knew I had to be ready, that one day it would all come out. James Reynolds snatched the papers out of my hands, his face becoming more and more tense as he glanced through the transactions and documents. The Wagner deal, the Collins merger, it all seemed so insignificant, such trifles against the background of what I was preparing. And here it is, the moment when I finally got the opportunity to turn this page. "It was you," he whispered, suddenly finding the clarity he had been trying to hide for so long. But I could explain. I was ready for this. Sophia stuttered back, her eyes darting around the room as if she was trying to find a way out of a maze she had created herself. At that moment, I realized that the hour of truth had come. Marcus's thunderous face left no room for doubt. He was no longer the person I had once built my life with. He was a stranger. And despite all this, I did not feel regret, only a cold calmness when he said, "This is Carla Larson." I said that I was enjoying every moment, every word came out of me like the truth that I had been hiding for years. But they all understood that I was telling the truth. I had a whole story. 7 different cities, 7 different rich people, 7 different scams. And it looks like Reynolds Industry was supposed to be number 8. There was a deathly silence in the room. I saw how their faces changed when they started reading the evidence. The confusion on Marcus's face, the horror on Victoria's face, James's growing rage, and the strangest picture, Sophia's perfect mask cracked. It wasn't just a defeat, it was the complete collapse of her carefully constructed life, her house of cards. From the moment everyone realized that I was telling the truth, nothing could bring it back. The elegant birthday party that everyone was so proud of quickly turned into chaos. The tension in the air became almost palpable as the faces of the guests began to change as they realized that there was more going on than just a family celebration. James Reynolds, a man who never allowed himself to lose control, was on edge. His face turned an alarming shade of purple as he reread the evidence. Each new moment, each fact only increased his anger. He was vulnerable, and it showed. He didn't know how to react. "Go away," he growled, turning to Sophia, who, in turn, was still trying to stutter, not knowing how to justify herself. She tried to maintain her dignity, but all her vanity and self-confidence collapsed in the blink of an eye. "Apologize," she said, but her words sounded like an inarticulate bluff. She was looking at James with a timid expression on her face, as if hoping for some kind of miracle. But this miracle did not happen. He was no longer the same person she had once slept in the same bed with. He was no longer ready to turn a blind eye to her dirty games. "Get out of my house before I—" His words were fragmentary, but I understood their essence. He wasn't going to let Sophia manipulate him like she used to. And so, at this moment, when everything collapsed, when they stood opposite each other in this luxurious, but now empty and dead room, I felt only relief. I felt this heavy, invisible weight fall off my shoulder when I no longer have to hide the truth, when I can finally look them in the eye and see their world crumbling. After all, their lives, their carefully constructed sand castle, were being destroyed by the fact that I decided to act. I was no longer the Tasha who silently endured their humiliation. I became the one who brought down this world, and despite all the cruelty of this moment, I was not afraid. Sophia tried to justify herself in a panic, her face turned red, but she knew it was over. Everything she had created crumbled to dust. I didn't regret telling the truth. It wasn't easy, it was necessary. The evidence I gathered, combined with what Reynolds Industries lawyers discovered when they began their search, was overwhelming. I couldn't believe the scale of what was happening under the noses of all these people who thought they were so smart and invulnerable. But now that the whole truth had been revealed, its consequences were inevitable. Sophia was facing serious fraud charges, and, according to the laws, she was facing huge fines, if not imprisonment. I couldn't believe that her plans and manipulations had gone so far that now she had no way back. Marcus, as I heard, was living in his friend's apartment, still trying to find a new meaning in life, trying to rebuild his career. But it was hard for him. His reputation was ruined, and no other financial firm wanted to hire a man fired for such catastrophic negligence. I couldn't say that I sympathized with him. He chose this path himself. Yes, he was once a part of my life, but now I didn't care where he lived or what he did. All those years I spent with him, and now it's over. It was like erasing footprints, like a sunset that inevitably comes, no matter how much you want to delay it. It's been 6 months since the day James Reynolds' birthday party changed everything. I was sitting in my new apartment. It wasn't as luxurious as the house I shared with Marcus, but it was perfect for me and for JJ. I felt like this change in my life was my new beginning. My son and I began to build our own world, a world in which there was no place for lies and manipulation, a world where everything was on our terms. The Reynolds family, despite everything that happened, gave me support that I didn't even expect. James handed me the keys to the apartment himself. "The least we could do," he said, as if justifying the gesture. But his words didn't move me as much as I expected. I didn't need anything from them except justice, but maybe they understood that this way they could at least compensate a little for the losses I suffered. James wasn't perfect, but he was an honest man, and I appreciated that. The apartment was not just a good gift, but a new chapter in my life. It was located in a good neighborhood, close to good schools, which was important to JJ. I could feel at ease knowing that my son would grow up in a safe and friendly environment, away from all those gloomy business games and dirty deals that had engulfed me at the time. JJ's room was decorated with posters of superheroes. It was his little world, his refuge, where there were no betrayals or shadows of the past. He was happy, and his happiness was the most important thing to me. I looked at him when he laughed, when he played with toys, when his little hands drew something on paper, and I realized that despite all the pain and disappointment, my life had found a new meaning. My small home office overlooked the park, and I, sitting at my desk, could look out the window, watch the children play, how the wind shakes the trees. Here I could think about everything that had happened, about what was left behind. It was no longer my old world, a world where I was a victim of circumstances. I was in control of my life now, and that was the most important thing. I worked from home, as before, only now everything was much calmer and easier. I didn't have to worry that someone was watching my every move, that someone would try to exploit my weaknesses. I was safe now. JJ and I were building our new world, a world that didn't include betrayal, lies, and manipulation. We started living by our own rules, and it was liberating. I no longer wanted to return to that old life. I did not want to be a part of that arrogant and cruel game in which I was once a prisoner. It was a completed chapter, and I understood that all my efforts, all the trials and pain had brought me here, to this new beginning. In this new world, I could be myself, and most importantly, be a good mother to JJ.